friends, romance, countrymen, bards, bears, lend me your ears. Friends, Romans, countrymen, bards, bears, lend me your ears. Friends, Romans, countrymen, bards, bears, lend me your ears. Friends, Romans, countrymen, bards, lend me your ears. Friends, Romans, countrymen, bards, lend me your ears.
Hello. In this video I'm going to be addressing a pop linguistics theory that's emerged and been spread on the internet. I've heard it a little bit out in the wild. I've seen it in the comments of my videos. I've done a little Google search and seen some Quora posts on it to make sure that this is something that several people actually think and I'm not just wasting my time making this video. And that is the idea that British English, or the British accent, was invented in the 1700s by British aristocrats in order to make themselves sound more refined, make themselves sound different from Americans or different from working class people. And this is usually tied up with specific sound changes like R loss, the fact that people with accents like mine don't pronounce the R sound in words like car or heart. That's the main one that I've seen, the idea that aristocrats told everyone to delete the R from certain words so that they'd sound better. And there are also other things like the trap-bath split, pronouncing different, using different sounds in words like trap and words like bath, and other things like that characterise southeastern British English accents. I'll quickly address my use of the term British English in the title. Obviously I just spat across the room. Obviously that's a massive generalisation. Britain has an enormous variety of accents and dialects. I use the term British English because I'm aiming this video at a kind of an audience that is interested and curious about linguistics but not already embedded in all of the literature, and so giving it a ridiculous wordy academic title is probably not going to appeal to those people in the same way that I wouldn't click on a video with a ridiculous academic physicsy title, so because of the target audience, I've used that generalized term. The same goes for American English. Obviously there's a huge range of accents in the US, so that's why I've used those terms in the title and thumbnail. So let's go through this theory bit by bit. First of all, it's worth saying that this isn't something that's debated within academic linguistics. It's widely considered to be kind of nonsense. That's not to say people who think it are stupid. It's just that a cursory glance at the phonetic descriptions of the last 500 years or so will show you that these sound changes happened organically and they weren't something that the aristocracy invented and imposed on people. It's not something that's debated within linguistics. There isn't two academic paradigms at loggerheads with each other here or anything like that. It's just something that a theory that's arisen in general that isn't really supported by evidence. So let's start with the idea that loss of R was imposed or invented in some way. I'll start by taking a recent well-intentioned comment from a video of mine, and bear in mind this comment wasn't put across aggressively at all, so when I pick it apart I'm just addressing the theory. I don't mean any disrespect to the person who commented. Around the 1700s, some young English aristocratic types, having nothing else to do, sat around the salons and thought that dropping the R sounded more elite, thus heart and hot would be the same word. Of course this isn't the best example because, as you can hear in my accent, heart and hot are still pronounced differently in most or all England English accents. An example where two words do collapse together is karma and karma.
Aside from all the glaring issues with the idea that the upper class could just force an accent on the working class without leaving any written evidence of it, why would they make the decision to drop the r sound to sound more elite? Dave Huxtable kind of made a skit about this in a video a little while ago, which I would recommend watching. Nowadays, non-rhotic accents like mine are seen as having prestige because we've learnt to associate them with more upper-class people, and even then it's very variable. Non-rhotic accents aren't seen as prestigious where I live because they're completely normal up and down the class spectrum. In my experience, it's people from rhotic areas of the Anglosphere like the US and Scotland that think of these accents as prestigious. If we're imagining that English was originally always rhotic and then some aristocrats decided to invent a non-rhotic way of speaking, they'd have been doing so out of nowhere with no good precedent for it sounding good. Of course, people are complicated and different people think different things sound good. It's not entirely unimaginable that someone might decide that pronouncing the r less strongly sounded more delicate or some impressionistic thing like that. But now we get into the actual historical evidence for the appearance of non-rhoticity. I'll start by covering stuff I've gone over before, but I'll go into a lot more step-by-step detail about the interpretation. In 1640, Ben Jonson wrote his English grammar, where he sifted through all the vowels and consonants and described the sounds associated with them. He said that R is the dog's letter and hurrieth in the sound, the tongue striking the inner palate with a trembling about the teeth. It sounded firm in the beginning of words and more liquid in the middle and ends, as in rarer, riper. The sound he seems to be describing is an alveolar trill, ra. If there was any doubt, John Wallis described a trill in similarly explicit detail 13 years later. Firm in the beginning of words and more liquid in the middle and ends is kind of ambiguous. It's usually interpreted as meaning that at the start of a word it's r, as he describes, and then it weakens to something like in other positions. Partly because that sound has become so normal in English that it would make sense for it to have been introduced by this point, and also because it fits his description, as vague as that description might be. It's more liquid in the sense that it's more continuous with less acoustic turbulence, rather than r. And he also doesn't indicate that this weaker variant is very different in terms of tongue position. Has basically the same tongue position as r in the grand scheme of things. This type of distribution also has a precedent in modern languages, so we know it can happen. Many Dutch speakers do a very similar thing, using a trill r at the starts of syllables and something like at the ends of syllables.
Reactor, reactor.
So it's not rock solid, but it's the best fit for Jonson's description, something like rarer and riper. In any case, the most relevant thing here is that it's weaker when it's not at the start of a word. This is clearly the start of a trajectory towards my non-rhotic way of speaking. At the time Jonson was writing in 1640, it's perfectly possible that some varieties of English pronounced it as the more liquid sound all the time. The reason I say this is because virtually all modern American accents have it as some kind of approximant sound, meaning something like in all positions, and the colonization of North America was well underway by 1640. Given the overwhelming preponderance of like sounds in modern southern England and America, and to a lesser extent Ireland, which still has some trill-like sounds in some dialects, and which was colonized on a similar timescale to America, I wouldn't be surprised if riper, rarer had some presence in southern English already, perhaps in lower class or rural dialects which phoneticians like Jonson weren't as interested in. But again, this is far from rock solid. 100 years after Jonson, in 1740, James Mather Flint released his pronunciation of the English language, written in French, where he said, R is pronounced as in French. Notice in a few words like here, fire, shear, 100, apron, citron, saffron, iron, where the E and O are pronounced, but slightly before the R. And remember that in a number of words, R before a consonant is greatly softened, almost silent, and makes the preceding vowel slightly longer, as in barb, guard, arm, yarn. Let's take this bit by bit. Nowadays, standard French uses the letter R to represent a uvular fricative sound like r, although plenty of dialects use a tap, ra, or trill, ra. While r is now the normal pronunciation in French, all evidence suggests that it wasn't yet in 1740. A German writing in 1791 commented that it seemed to me that in Paris at least a quarter of the residents made a croaking sound, not because they can't pronounce the proper R sound, but because a perceived pleasantness has been placed upon it, and it's ended up becoming fashionable. And this fashion can't fade away like others, because whole families have long forgotten the tongue R, presumably r, and the croaking sound will be passed down the generations. Now back to Mather Flint's description. The most relevant part is his comment that in many words, R before a consonant is greatly softened, almost silent, and makes the preceding vowel slightly longer. This pre-consonantal position is one of the ones where r has been lost in my accent. However, all the example words he gives here have the same vowel: barb, guard, arm, yarn. This is a vowel with a low tongue position, in Flint's time probably something like low central, ah, barb, guard, arm, yarn. This is very telling. Both the r and r sounds have high, tense tongue positions, and so to go from a low vowel like a to one of these sounds takes a relatively long time. It would make sense for this to be one of the first vowels after which r is weakened. Exactly what Flint means by almost mute is difficult to say. In the examples I just read out, I just said the vowel and made it slightly R-coloured at the end. Guard. On the other hand, it could have actually not even been a rhotic consonant anymore, and just been a slight upward glide of the tongue. Guard. In any case, the fact that this is only described after low vowels suggests a systematic weakening of r, which is completely in line with how sound changes often work. It would be weird to find such a systematic rule that somebody had invented out of nowhere to sound more posh. He also notes that it disappears before a consonant, but doesn't say it disappears at the end of a word as it would in my accent. This is something with modern precedents. My grandfather from the northwest of England is fully non-rhotic before a consonant, harp, but often rhotic at the end of a word even if no other word follows, better. This position before a consonant is a more stable candidate for somewhere that r would be lost. R hanging at the end of a word is likely to come into contact with other vowels in flowing speech, and if it's lost, two vowels may end up directly one after the other, which can be awkward to pronounce if you're not used to it. But r followed by a consonant is protected from that, so it makes sense that it would be lost first. So Mather Flint's contemporaries were losing their r sounds in a limited set of contexts. If they were to say this strange phrase, they might pronounce it something like red, rare, harper. What's the next step on the way to non-rhoticity? In 1773, Abraham Tucker wrote Vocal Sounds, another treatise on how English sounds are pronounced. He goes through the English speech sounds one by one, imagining that you make them in sequence, moving your tongue gradually to make each sound. For him, the sound associated with the letter R has the same tongue position as the one associated with the letter L, and upon rendering the end of the tongue limber so that it will shake like a rag with the bellows, it will rattle out r, but this requiring a strong stream of breath to perform makes it the most laborious letter of all, and consequently you shall find people drop the R in furs, partial, servants, which is a variant of servants which was common back then, worst, worsted, backward, and many other words, and whenever retained we speak it so gently that you scarce hear a single reverberation of the tongue. He's initially clearly describing a trill again, r. This is exactly how a trill is made, by holding the tongue still against the alveolar ridge and blasting air across it so that it rattles against the ridge. He also clearly describes R dropping before consonants, this time after all sorts of vowels, not just low ones. Furs, partial, servants. After this description he says something interesting. It would make an Englishman sweat to repeat this line of Ennius in the manner he ought, but a Welshman would rattle it off manfully. So he suggests that Welsh English speakers is still using trills, r, which is believable because many of them still do now. But throughout this whole passage he seems to be suggesting English people don't pronounce the full trill because they struggle with it. His first passage could be interpreted a number of ways. He's definitely saying that the proper pronunciation associated with this letter is a trill, r, and that the sound is often lost altogether before a consonant. But he says whenever retained you scarce hear a single reverberation of the tongue. This implies that in some cases there is a rhotic consonant of some kind, but it doesn't involve reverberations of the tongue. This seems to describe the sound The vagueness here is in the distribution of these sounds. He might be saying that some people do have a rhotic sound before consonants and that sound is contrasting with a trill in other positions, reared. Or he might be saying that people in practice always drop R's before consonants and always use an approximant for R's in the positions where it isn't dropped, reared. I lean towards the latter interpretation because he doesn't specify that some people do this sometimes, but he seems to generalize it, contrasting the way people should technically pronounce the letter, ra, and the way that people actually pronounce it in real life, dropped before a consonant and otherwise. So to add some extra words to his word list, just so that we have some word initial ones, we may be looking at servants, worst, backward, red, runner or runner. All of a sudden this sounds awfully like modern southeastern British English. The loss of R, while technically being a fairly small and mundane sound change, causes our modern ears to suddenly not hear it as American or Irish anymore, but instead as southeastern British. Tucker's description seems to have a faint undertone of prescriptivism. English people should pronounce the R properly, but they're not, and as a result they can't even pronounce Latin properly. This is mildly contrary to the idea that R loss was seen as a good or prestigious thing. Less than 20 years later, in 1791, John Walker published his Critical Pronouncing Dictionary, which contained a page on the rhotic consonant. He starts by saying, the letter R is never silent. Very interesting. So is he saying that his contemporaries speak rhotically again? He then makes an interesting observation. There's a distinction in the sound of this letter never noticed by any of our writers on the subject, which is in my opinion of no small importance, and that is the rough and smooth R. The rough R is formed by jarring the tip of the tongue against the roof of the mouth near the 4 teeth. The smooth R is a vibration of the lower part of the tongue near the root, against the inward region of the palate near the entrance to the throat. Here he's distinguishing between a trill, ra, and probably some kind of approximant, perhaps a velarized one as he mentions a back tongue articulation, ra. He goes on to say, the latter R, that is the approximant is that which marks the pronunciation of England, and the former, that is the trill, that of Ireland. In England, and particularly in London, the R in lard, bard, card, regard is pronounced so much in the throat as to be little more than the Middle or Italian a, lengthened into ba, bard, card, regard, while in Ireland the R in these words is pronounced with so strong a jar of the tongue against the forepart of the palate as to produce that harshness we call the Irish accent. This lines up with our trajectory very well. An approximant in all contexts in England, presumably he's mainly talking about southeastern England, and a trill in all positions in Ireland. He also echoes what Mather Flint said decades earlier in 1740, that the rhotic consonant is generally lost after a and before a consonant, bard, card, regard. Anyway, Walker goes on to say, but if this letter is too forcibly pronounced in Ireland, it's often too feebly founded in England, and particularly in London, where it's sometimes entirely sunk. And it may perhaps be worthy observation that, provided we avoid a too forcible pronunciation of the R when it ends a word or is followed by a consonant in the same syllable, we may give as much force as we please to this letter at the beginning of a word, without producing any harshness to the ear. Thus, Rome, river, rage may have the R as forcible as in Ireland, but bar, bard, card, hard must have it nearly as soft as in London. So what does this tell us? It tells us that Londoners were sometimes entirely dropping their R's and that Walker considered this a bad thing, and that he also considered overpronouncing R a bad thing if it wasn't at the start of a word. His advice in this paragraph implies a lot. He says that an Irish pronunciation of R, by which he said he means r, should be avoided before a consonant and word finally, but he's already said that entirely sinking the R is too feeble, but that Londoners do it in practice. This implies that he recommends an approximate in those environments. He then recommends that people more forcibly pronounce the R word initially, even to the point of the Irish sound, r. This implies that in London, what he's actually hearing is Rome, river, rage, bar, card, hard. But what he would rather hear, what he recommends, is Rome, river, rage, bar, card, hard. The older pattern, probably similar to Johnson's pattern from all the way back in 1640, is disappearing, replaced with a non-rhotic pattern that sounds a lot more modern, and at least one person, Walker, thinks this is a bad thing. This timing lines up with other lines of evidence. The colonisation of Australia started around when Walker was writing, and Australian accents of English are almost universally non-rhotic. Rhoticity has some remnants in modern non-rhotic accents, which are very likely to have been in circulation in Walker's time, because they appear in the earliest audio recordings just 100 years later, and because they make perfect sense as the immediate fossils left by rhoticity, rather than some new thing that was introduced decades later. The first of these is a tendency to still pronounce r at the end of a word if it's immediately followed by a word starting with a vowel, to avoid the two vowels directly contacting each other. On its own, ba, but with another word after, the bar is clean. Baris, baris. The r gets reintroduced to prevent the awkward sequence bais. An upshot of this is that it leads to a weird distribution where there's this invisible r phoneme inherent to sounds like bar, water, baker, but which only surfaces sometimes in flowing speech, in contrast to words like spar, Victoria, Africa, which ended with the exact same vowel sounds as non-rhotic bar, water, baker, but didn't have this historic r at the end that could surface to separate it from a following word. This distribution is difficult for a speaker to keep track of, and so for many people, perhaps from the very start of non-rhoticity or perhaps in the decades following, they began using r as a separator in these contexts, whether there had been a r there historically or not. The spar is, Africa is. By the 1850s, this so-called intrusive R was a feature of working-class London accents, often derided by non-working-class people, as in this Punch cartoon. Perhaps upper-class people were more likely to have a sense of how words were conventionally spelled, and so had a better idea of where the r sound had existed historically, and where it should and shouldn't still be pronounced at the ends of words in flowing speech, although it's likely that upper-class people used intrusive R sometimes as well, and it was just another stick they could opportunistically use to bash working-class people with. Michael McMahon compiles several examples of writers in the 17 and 1800s talking about intrusive R. Sheridan in 1762 mentions it as something that Cockneys, i.e. working-class Londoners, did, and Elphinston in 1787 mentioned it happening in educated speech as well. In any case, that's one leftover feature from the days of rhoticity. The second feature is that where a r sound had once existed, especially in a stressed syllable, what remained was a vowel that was held for longer to compensate for the missing consonant, or a vowel with a slightly centralised off-glide. Bear didn't become bear, it became bear. You'll hear how the glides to a more central tongue position at the end. Air, air. Michael McMahon draws attention to William Henry Henslow, who in his Phonathron in 1840 says that English does not pronounce these words as auger, ochre, but instead as auger, ochre, explicitly noting that the final vowel that replaces the r is the same vowel that French uses in words like je, me, de. McMahon also cites Smart 1836 as a source that suggests that rhotic pronunciations could still be heard in educated speech at that point, but elsewhere said that non-rhoticity was normal for the most part. I'd recommend McMahon's chapter in the Cambridge History of the English Language for more interesting examples. An important thing to note is that this R loss was almost certainly limited to London up and down the class spectrum, and as the 1800s marched on and posher people increasingly picked up non-rhoticity, to educated people's dialects in the southeast and to some extent elsewhere in England. Dialects outside of London were overwhelmingly rhotic until at least 1900, when the acceleration of non-rhoticity started to seriously spread through England. Early dialect transcriptions and audio recordings show rhotic accents across the country, including in the southeast outside of London. So the scope of non-rhoticity was extremely limited until fairly late on, exaggerated by the fact that it was people with non-rhotic accents who tended to get their accents out there in film and on the radio. In the last 100 years it's become the norm in England not to pronounce R's unless there's a vowel immediately afterwards. So that's R loss covered, a phenomenon that was at least mildly stigmatised by educated people until about 1800, before it started to seriously catch on in upper-class accents, having already existed in less prestigious accents for ages. The other thing I'll briefly mention is the fact that southeastern English accents have a split between the vowel in trap, cat, map, and the vowel in bath, pass, cast. I've done a more in-depth video on this that you're welcome to watch, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say that it definitely wasn't invented in the 1700s to sound posher either. It started in the 1600s where the trap vowel, then almost certainly a in London, lengthened before th, s, f, and certain consonant clusters involving n. So cat, trap, but bath, cast, cart. This longer vowel gradually lowered and took a more back tongue position, so that by the time of Walker in 1791, who also described the vowels, it's described as being no longer the front quality of cat, but instead more like the Italian a vowel with a low central tongue position. So in 1791 you have cat, trap, and bath, cast, cart, or cart in non-rhotic accents. Only in the very late 1700s do phoneticians start to hint at a back vowel. Cat, trap, bath, cast, cart. And this seems to be seen as a working class or common thing until the mid-1800s, with bath, cast, cart being favoured in educated speech, until just shortly before the era of audio recording, the bath, cast, cart pronunciations started to be accepted by more educated people, as Alexander Ellis notes in the 1860s. Sound change is, of course, a continuous process, with standard southeastern British English changing as much in the last 140 years since audio recording was invented as it did in the 140 years before it was invented. The received pronunciation of Bertrand Russell is long gone, and even so, it didn't sound much like the educated speech of 1790, when park the car in Harvard Yard would have sounded more educated than park the car in Harvard Yard. This is, of course, usually the way. Sound changes emerge in someone's speech, remain stigmatised for ages, and then begrudgingly become accepted when enough people start picking them up. And then, within a couple of generations, the old pronunciation is largely forgotten about. And if there are audio recordings of it, it sounds stilted and weird, and if there aren't audio recordings of it, people find it hard to believe that it was ever normal. The reality of historical sound change is something we find hard to accept until we look at the evidence for ourselves. When we're children, we learn to associate certain ways of speaking with certain kinds of people, upper class, working class, Irish, whatever it might be. But we don't recognise that these associations are experience-based and not something that's intrinsic to the accents. This leads us to think in an intuitive but pseudo-scientific way about the accents we're familiar with. We English people can't have spoken like that because it sounds Irish or American, and we wouldn't have sounded like Irish or Americans, or Anglo-English accents must be made up because my American accent is normal and neutral, so someone must have invented it, otherwise by default they'd all speak like me. Any sound change is put down to some kind of external influence or pressure by the ruling classes, because otherwise why would sounds not just stay the same? The reality is that sounds change all the time, organically. People speak in more mechanically efficient ways when they're talking quickly, children pick up those mechanical shortcuts and assume they're normal, vowels drift away from each other to avoid words sounding the same and making speech more confusing, other sounds merge together so that our brains don't have to maintain as much phonological hardware. Conservative speakers rail back against sound changes that hadn't already happened by the time they were born. Innovative speakers embrace it to signal membership of the group that they belong to. And even all that is a gross simplification. American accents have changed and diversified as well, of course.
Oh, many Americans do you know that sound like this. But mild tribal thinking keeps us from seeing the nuances here. British exceptionalism tells us that this is the way English people have always spoken and the Americans messed it up. American exceptionalism bites back and says no, the English messed it up and they used to speak just like Americans. Neither is true. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll talk to you again soon.